All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, good afternoon. This is the Society of Wetland Scientists August webinar. My name is Nate Hufsney, and I'll be the moderator today. We have a fantastic turnout for the event, and I'm looking forward to announcing the topic and presenter for our October webinar later in the program. The SWS webinar program has proven to be a great addition to our membership benefits list, so if you enjoy this content, please provide that feedback to the Society and tell your friends to join and come on and engage with content every month. I'm also excited about the opportunity to provide our members with more great educational content as we move through the remainder of the year, we move through fiscal years and new cycles. So there'll be a lot of stuff coming forward as we move as a society. Today's webinar will follow a general format of 40 to 45-minute presentation by our speaker, Mary Cantula, Dr. Mary Cantula, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions from the participants. You can actually type those into the chat box, and we will log those and take them in the order they are received when we get to the end of the talk. So really quickly, the housekeeping items that we have to go through before we get started. Just to familiarize yourself with the GoToMeeting screens, there's an attendee control panel that I just mentioned where you can control the audio for the webinar using your telephone or your mic and speakers. And as I said, anytime during the talk you can provide questions into the questions pane. We'll answer those at the end just to keep away from any distractions, but feel free to type them in as they come to mind. We'll also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey at the end that'll pop up on its own. Please use this to help us plan future SWS educational events and webinars. And a little bit of a slide delay there, but I am very, very happy to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Mary Cantula. She is a wetlands ecologist with the U.S. EPA's National Health and Environmental Effects Laboratory, Western Ecology Division in Corvallis, Oregon. From 1992 to 1996, she served as the National Program Leader for the agency's Wetland Research Program and was responsible for directing and coordinating studies of freshwater wetlands across the nation. Mary's current work supports the EPA's National Aquatic Resource Surveys through the development of monitoring and reporting on the ecological condition of wetlands. Among her awards, the Society of Wetland Scientists recognized Dr. Cantula with the Merit Award in 2007, very prestigious award, and that was for her work in assessing wetlands at the watershed scale. This was followed by the successful completion of the 2011 National Wetland Condition Assessment, or the NWCA, and Mary's research team is currently providing technical support for the 2016 assessment, which we'll hear about today. Dr. Cantula has also been extremely involved in the Society over the course of her career, serving as a past treasurer and president. And I'm very happy to say that this webinar has actually came to bear from some of her collaborators at EPA and some of the discussions we had at a regional chapter meeting of SWS Northwest, and we really appreciate and value her contributions to the regional chapter. So we would clap if we were all in the same room, but let's welcome Mary. And Mary, I guess I'll just go ahead and turn things over to you now.
Thank you very much, Nate. And it's a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to share with you all some information about the 2011 National Wetland Condition Assessment and a little bit about the 2016 assessment, which is going on as we speak, but beginning to slow up facing the end of the sampling season. But as you might guess, whoops. I'm not matching the delay there. Sorry about that. As you might guess, an assessment of this scope takes a lot of people to accomplish and turn into a successful effort. And I'd like to recognize all the different groups and organizations that cooperated to make the 2011 assessment a success. And I also want to recognize all the members of the Office of Research and Development's NWCA analysis team and the advisors from the other aquatic surveys who helped us getting through our first time assessment of the national data. We couldn't have done it without this group of talented people. So what I'm going to do today is, first of all, give you a quick overview of monitoring and assessment, a little bit of history, and then move into an introduction to the NWCA, in particular, defining for you some important concepts. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about the analysis and reporting for the national assessment. And I'll wrap up talking about some of the innovations that we made for the 2016 sample based on what we learned in 2011, and suggest some applications for research and policy decision making. Whoops, it's not, there it goes. The NWCA is part of, longer delay this time, so I'm going to have to not be so anxious. Sorry about that to the audience. The NWCA is part of the U.S. EPA's National Aquatic Resource Surveys that are known as NARS. And NARS is unique because it builds from almost 20 years of research of pilot studies done under the Office of Research and Development's Monitoring and Assessment Program. And this is one of the few cases where a long-term research program was moved for implementation by the program office. So we're really proud of that. The NARS surveys are composed of rivers and streams, lakes and reservoirs, coastal and wetland systems. And every 5 years, a survey of the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of these systems is completed for the conterminous United States. And I want to mention that it's really important that we're sampling physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of these aquatic systems. And that was done purposely because there was an objective in the Clean Water Act to restore, maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So the design all was done to connect to the agency's mission under the Clean Water Act. But looking at monitoring and assessment overall, you find that we really have a rich history here in the United States, beginning with the Corps of Discovery expedition in the early 1800s that was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And during their work, they mapped the areas that they traversed and took copious notes on the landscape, and also, as you can see here from these drawings from their journals, also took excellent records on the biology, the types of plants and animals that they found along the way. The second half of the 1800s is really rich with national surveys, particularly in the Midwest and West. And one of my favorites is the exploration of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River, led by John Wesley Powell. And you might know that Powell is the first head of the U.S. Geologic Survey, and in that position he promoted and participated in a number of assessments and surveys in the West and other parts of the country, and began an effort to produce topographic maps of the entire nation. So NWCA has a really rich history, and actually the entire NARS and all of our work at large-scale assessments. So let me tell you a bit about important aspects of the NWCA. It has three objectives, of course, is to produce a national report describing the ecological condition of the nation's wetlands, and to report on the stressors that are commonly associated with poor wetland condition. This entire effort is centered on collaboration with states and tribes to develop monitoring tools, share techniques, and with the whole idea of moving toward using common methods for monitoring and assessment of wetlands. And of course, the first two objectives advances the science of wetland monitoring and assessment, particularly with an eye to support management needs. So a couple important definitions for you to understand exactly what the results from the survey represent. And first of all, and most important, is what is the definition of wetland we used. And the definition is posted here, and it comes from the report of the classification of wetlands and deepwater habitats of the United States by Luke Worden et al. And it is an ecological definition and not a legal definition. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Secondly comes the definition of our target population, which is a subset of all the wetlands that would have been subsumed by that broad definition I just showed you. So specifically, our target population is tidal and non-tidal wetlands of the conterminous United States, including farm wetlands not currently in crop production. And the wetlands, in order to be sampled, had to have rooted vegetation, rooted wetland vegetation, and when present, open water less than a meter deep. Another requirement for doing the NARS surveys is that you have a digital representation of your target population. And luckily, when we were planning for the 2011 assessment, we had one that existed. And that was the sample frame that's used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Status and Trends Program. And the map of the U.S. shows the distribution of their 4 square mile plots that were based on 2005 photography. As you notice, there's some parts of the United States that are a little empty due to the distribution of wetlands across the nation. And because we hope to report out on all 3 coasts, EPA worked with Status and Trends to add additional plots to the Pacific coast, and you see those on the right-hand side of the slide. And here's a look at the final results of the 2011 assessment and the distribution of the 1,138 sites that were sampled. And you note in the little insert here at the bottom of the slide that we also sampled sites on the North Slope of Alaska. And this was because the state was just determined to be part of the first NWCA, and they worked very hard to get funding and to collect all the data and get out a report of their assessment. If you would have been out with the field crews during the assessment in 2011 or 2016, you'd see them setting up something similar to this diagram on the ground. This is our standard assessment area and buffer, and we had rules for adjusting this arrangement to make it fit for the conditions on site. But fundamentally what the crews did is they took the coordinates from the design and navigated to that point on the ground, and that's represented by the star in the diagram, and then set up, in this case, a half-hectare circular plot with a radius of 40 meters. And within that plot, they set up 5 10 by 10 meter vegetation plots, and associated with 4 of those plots, they dug soil pits, described the soils, and took soil samples. And all the other data we collected in the assessment area covered that entire half-hectare. In addition, we wanted to know something about the setting of the assessment area, and so we established a buffer area extending 10 meters from the assessment area out into the surroundings, and established 3 plots along each of 4 transects set up in the cardinal directions, and one of those plots we also put in the center of the assessment area. So the categories of data we collected are listed here, and the ones that are in gold are the ones that I'll be focusing on as I discuss the results. But to give you some idea about the level of effort it took to get it done, here's a listing of the numbers of samples that were collected and processed for various indicators. And here we have the numbers of pages of data forms that we processed and scanned and entered into databases. So now moving on to the data analysis and results. And one of the first things we had to decide was how many reporting units were we going to be able to use. And as we used, the background of the map here is an aggregation of Almernix Level 3 ecoregions. And in this case, there are 9 ecoregions. And in the NARS surveys, we have a rule that we want to have at least 50 sites per reporting unit. And this is partly based on the requirements of the design. And so when we looked at the distribution of the points, you can see of a number of areas in some of the ecoregions that are pretty empty, so we knew we were going to have to aggregate to fewer ecoregions from this original 9. And what we ended up with were 4 NWCA aggregated ecoregions depicted here, and you can see the difference from what we started with. We also had another aggregation to do because we wanted to be able to report out on wetland types. And the 7 wetland types that we used in the design are listed here across the bottom in the codes from the status and trends map. And we aggregated them into herbaceous and woody, basically inland wetlands, and herbaceous and woody tidal wetlands. And so we can report out on the 4 ecoregions and the 4 wetland types, and then a combination of both of them except for the case of the estuarine, because unfortunately we did end up with having too few samples on the west coast to report out on all 3 coasts. So this is what the 1,138 sites look like, distributed across those 4 ecoregions. The next thing we had to do is take those 1,138 sites and array them along the disturbance gradient. And we began with defining the best part of the gradient. In other words, what our quantitative definition of reference was going to be. And we used the definitions of Stoddard et al. And for all of the NARS assessments, we use least disturbed as our definition for reference. And least disturbed sites are those that represent the best available conditions given the current state of the landscape. And because this was the first time through for wetlands, we also decided to see how it worked with the definition for minimally disturbed, which are sites that have no evidence of significant human disturbance. So how this worked was we used a screening approach that you can imagine as a large funnel with a screen in it that has a mesh size that represents a threshold of one of our 10 disturbance indices. So for instance, it could be, our screen could be the alien plants in the assessment area, and the threshold is greater than 5% of the relative cover. So then we take and load up all of those 1,138 sites into the funnel and see what makes it through the sieve. And those that do not violate the threshold then become potential reference sites. So exactly, what are the details of how this worked? It's important to realize that our definition of reference is customized by NWCA aggregated ecoregion. The initial thresholds were set to be very strict. We started with the definition of minimally disturbed, and then we relax them as needed based on the least disturbed condition of the region. And we determined the thresholds in several ways. In the case of data, particularly that collected on disturbances in the buffer and hydrologic disturbances, were basically counts of observed presence. And then we use published backgrounds of concentrations for soil chemistry, and then match those up with natural breaks in the data. And finally, for relative cover of alien plant species, we use best professional judgment based on a thorough examination of the literature. And the reference sites had to pass the thresholds for all 10 of our disturbance indices, And this definition is not intended to change with time. However, we will use it. We'll use the same criteria every time we're in the field so that we continue to add to our pool of reference sites. And this is a map of the distribution of the sites by disturbance class. And you can see the numbers of sites we had in each class here in the legend to the map. And one of the things that we wanted to do is see if what we were doing, with the mathematics and the analysis made sense on the ground. So through the magic of Google Earth, we looked at a number of our sites to see if, again, the analysis made sense with what we were seeing on the ground. So the location of the assessment area is indicated by the yellow pushpin on the photo here. And I want you to pay attention to the area in bold in the box here in the upper right corner of the slide. And you'll note that for this slide that was classed as most disturbed, failed the thresholds for the disturbance indices. And in the case of least disturbed, this is an example of one of those. We had scores for 3 of the 10 indices, but none of them exceeded the thresholds. And we did find sites that fit the definition of minimally disturbed, and for those we had no scores for any of our disturbance indices. So with that, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the results. And the structure of the UNARS reporting has these 3 categories, and I'll walk you through each of them, beginning with biological condition. And first thing you need to know is what exactly these results represent. So the NWCA target population has an estimated wetland area of about 95 million acres. And of those 95 million acres, we can report on a little over 62 million, and that's 967 sites. The sites that were not assessed, that we cannot report on and use in our estimates were not assessed primarily because of access being denied or that the sites were inaccessible, which essentially translates to there were safety issues or it was so very expensive to get into that site. So beginning with, again, the biological condition, and it was measured by a vegetation multimetric index. And the condition categories that we'll be using in the results are listed here, and they are based on the distribution of the values of the VMMI for the least disturbed sites for each of the regions. And you can see how that works here on the diagram on the left. And here are the results for biological condition. And let me walk you through some of the components of this graphic because you'll see the same sort of presentation for all the results. First of all, we have the reporting units here on the left, in this case, the nation and the 4 aggregated ecoregions. I'll show you some results next with the nation and our 4 aggregated wetland types. Again, we're looking at data from the vegetation MMI. It's presented in both percent area and in absolute area for each of the reporting units. The error bars on the graph are 95% confidence intervals, and again, that applies to all cases. But the most important thing is taking a look at the national results. And you see here that for our target population, about 48% of the wetland area is found to be in good condition. And that pattern holds up through our 2 easternmost ecoregions, but starts changing to the Midwest. And then with the West, we see that it's totally flipped, with the poor condition being the largest category. And now if we take a look at it, at these results in terms of the aggregated wetland classes, you can see again this pattern that we saw nationally with 48% in good condition is reflected across all of the wetland types. And the inland woody wetland types were the largest in terms of absolute area. As I move into the stressors, I thought perhaps you might want to see some of the details of the results about non-native plants because there's a lot of interest in them. And you'll note again at a national level, the largest category at 61% of the area of the target population was the area of wetland exposed to low amounts of the stressor non-native plants. But again, if we look across the regions, we see a little different pattern. And I'd like to concentrate on the high and very high stressor levels. And you see again in those easternmost ecoregions, it's fairly low and increases through the plains and is largest for the west. But what I thought was really interesting is that if you look at the absolute area, again concentrating on the high and very high levels of that stressor, that the absolute area is about the same across the U.S., every place we looked. So one of the important questions we wanted to answer was the relationship between stressors and biological condition. And we do this using the concepts of relative extent, relative risk, and attributable risk that we borrowed from the medical literature. So let me explain how we applied medical science to wetland ecology. So the first case, we're looking at the relative extent of stressors. We're looking only at the percent area for the stressors listed that were at high levels. And essentially, when we're looking at relative extent, we're concentrating on an expression of the severity of the exposure. So for instance, in the medical literature, you would read about the numbers of people that are heavy smokers or have high levels of cholesterol or are obese, for instance, as some stressor, human stressor categories we hear in the news. In the case of wetlands, we had a big three. Vegetation removal, illustrated here by a site that was regularly mowed. Hardening, illustrated here by pavement, which we did find in wetlands. But actually, what caused most of the hardening was compacting that we saw was compaction of soils due to the activities of animals, people, and vehicles. And the third most common stressor was ditching. The next piece of the puzzle is relative risk, and relative risk indicates the likelihood of having poor condition when the magnitude of the stressor is high versus low. And again, in medical parlance, this was used to establish the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, high cholesterol, and heart disease, and obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And if you look again at our results here, first of all, a value of 1 means that there is no relationship, and so any value above 1 indicates that there is a significant relationship between poor condition and the level of this stressor in the wetlands. And you can see that practically everything that we looked at has a strong relationship to poor condition in wetlands. And finally, the last piece is attributable risk. And what attributable risk gets at is the proportion of the population in poor condition that would be improved if the effects of a particular stressor were removed or minimized. So again, back to the medical example, it would be like saying how many fewer people would get lung cancer if they stopped smoking? How many fewer people would die of heart disease if they lower their cholesterol. So you got the idea, and looking at our results for wetlands, we have, again, the top three, vegetation removal, hardening, and ditching standing out. The whole pattern here reflects the influence of the relative extent results. Basically, attributable risk combines both of these results into the answers we're getting here. But if you look across all the stressors, you see that the error bars are very large and overlapping, so we really don't have a clear result or pattern. So with that whirlwind presentation of the results of the NWCA, let me talk a little about 2016. And when we were aggregating the 9 ecoregions down to 4, the one part that really bothered us was having to combine the Western Mountains and the Xeric West. And they just seemed so different to us ecologically. Our results in looking at these aggregation using the vegetation data indicated that we'd probably be all right, and as the results turned out, actually this regionalization worked pretty well, but it still bothered us. And as Nate said, the Pacific Northwest chapter gave us an opportunity to present our results at their last annual meeting, and we really wanted to present some results that related to the Pacific Northwest because we knew our audience would be interested. So we resurrected this question and took a look at how would the answers change focusing on the Western Mountains. And so here are the results focusing on the 38 sites, which isn't an ideal sample size for our analysis, but our results turned out pretty well as compared to we got nationally for the Xeric West. So this made us even more determined to see if we could disaggregate that Western ecoregion into 2. And so this is basically what we wanted to accomplish. And but adding points to the sample points to the S&T frame wasn't really going to help us because of those empty places that you saw in the original map of our sampling frame. But luckily, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetland Inventory, about the same time we were planning for 2016, was completing stitching together their digital maps to complete wall-to-wall coverage of the U.S. So for the 2016 design, we were able to combine status and trends and the NWI maps into a combined sample frame for the 2016 assessment. So this is what all of the sample points that were possible for 2016 from the design look like across the nation. I know you're wondering what happened in Minnesota, but that's all the number of points there are the result that Minnesota is one of the states that asked Office of Water for funding to do a state intensification. And so those extra points are there so that Minnesota had enough samples to report out on the state. So last, I'd like to talk a little bit about the applications of the data to scientific research and hopefully a portion of the audience here. And I thought of 3 things that the data might be useful. First of all, our 2011 assessment set national and regional benchmarks for tracking changes in the resource over time. And in the NWCA and throughout NARS, we do that. We use the beginning survey as the benchmark, and we'll start tracking status and trends. But it also can be used in other research. One area that we've had some discussions has to do with climate change. We also developed quantitative descriptions of the characteristics of least disturbed wetlands, actually, and minimally disturbed wetlands and wetlands in good condition. And these definitions then could be used also as a type of reference for scientific research. And finally, if you're interested in looking at the effects of particular stressors on wetland condition or function, we've identified which are the most common stressors, and those most likely associated with poor condition that can help focus that research. In the case of policy, let me give you an example of national policy and how it might work. And in this case, I want to talk about the no net loss policy recommended by the National Wetlands Policy Forum that was adopted by the first President Bush in 1989 and by every president since. But in particular, I want to go back to the report and take a look at what they recommended. First of all, the no net loss, what we know as the no net loss policy, was the short-term goal they recommended, and they wanted it measured in wetland quantity and quality. And we know that Status and Trends has been doing an excellent job of this for well over a decade. And now with the NWCA, we can add quality to that tracking of no net loss. But also, the forum had a long-term goal of having a net gain in wetland quantity and quality. And we can get, again, both of the pieces of that goal now that we have an NWCA. So what are the policy implications of the NWCA results? First of all, as with science, we set a benchmark for tracking our progress toward the no net loss policy. So using the same sample frame as the Status and Trends program in the NWC was important for two reasons. One was it gave us a sample frame from which to proceed, and the second was we were tying together the efforts at tracking wetland quality and quantity nationally. Secondly, the idea of tracking the quality of the wetlands raises the question, is the current status of wetland quality what we want as a target for no net loss? And if you remember, our results indicated that approximately 50% of the wetland area nationally is in good condition, while 30% is in poor condition. So maybe that deserves some discussion whether that's an appropriate benchmark if we want to change it. And finally, identification again of critical stressors are important to formulating policy and regulations so that there can be a targeted approach to improving wetland quality. So with that, I hope I piqued your interest in the NWCA and want to tell you where you can get more information. First of all, you can find the final and technical reports and the analysis databases at this website. And in addition, you can find the field operation manuals and the laboratory operation manuals. For those who have students or students out there, EPA has a campus research challenge where there are $10,000 grants available for ideas on how to use the data from NARS. The solicitation for the NWCA unfortunately ends September 30th. So if you are interested, go to this website and see what's required to submit a proposal. And perhaps you'll be adding to these findings about the findings from the NWCA. And finally, the analysis team is looking forward to the production of a topical collection, which is an electronic version of a special issue of the journal Environmental Monitoring and Assessment. And we just recently had our first two papers accepted. The first one, they report on the survey design and the results from the water chemistry. And so those papers you should see in a future, not too distant future, issue of Environmental Monitoring and Assessment. So with that, I thank you for your attention and your interest in the NWCA.
All right, Mary, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that means everybody else can. Well, thank you very much, Mary. We really appreciate that. It's been a great introduction to the work that's been going on over the last several years at the NWCA. And we are very fortunate to have several questions. I'm going to go ahead and read these aloud, but they're also in the questions box for those of you playing along at home. So you can pop that out and make it a larger window in addition to the viewer toolbox. So the first question is from Aaron Donato, and that was, what was the process for selecting sample sites throughout the country? And I think you did touch on that, but if you want to reiterate that, that one came through about 15 minutes ago.
Okay, well, the process was a spatially balanced probability sample. And I can't begin to explain this very simply. But what the important components were is that every one of those points has a known probability of being selected. And that's why I can tell you exactly what our sample represents. We tie that to wetland areas since each of those points represents a particular area of wetland of a particular type of the country. And if you want to know more about it, like I said, the paper on the design was just accepted in Environmental Monitoring and Assessment, and there's a thorough discussion of the design in the technical report that's on the web. So I know that's kind of a light answer. I guess the other suggestion is if you're interested in knowing more of the details of the design, let me know, and I can put you in touch with Tony Olson, who does the designs for all the NARS and for the states and other folks who come to him who would like to have a probability design, and see if he can give a webinar for SWS.
Thanks, Mary. And the next question came in at 11:30. It was from Kirsty Simpson, and she wanted to know if you looked at any Alaska wetlands and the removal of permafrost as a stressor.
I know that they looked at the permafrost as part of the assessment in the North Slope. And I know that in particular because of the difficulty they had in digging the soil pits and doing the descriptions. The summary of the report from Alaska is part of the final report of the National Wetland Condition Assessment. So you can see exactly what they looked at there and what they found. But I don't believe they addressed that specific question. At least I'm not aware of it.
All right, thank you. And then Aaron Donato has a couple more good questions. And one of your stressor categories was vegetation replacement. How is this category defined?
Well,
Aaron, if you want to type in to clarify, pardon me real quick, Mary. And Aaron, if you want to clarify anything about the question, you can type that into the chat window as we're taking these questions to kind of expand further. So just to repeat, how is the vegetation replacement category defined?
Basically, we were looking at instances where you saw that that an area had been cut and trees had been replaced with herbaceous vegetation, or you were in an area where you could see stumps of a particular type of tree that grew in a wetland, and you saw plantings of something that was totally different. So for instance, one thing that I know that happens in Delaware is the replacement of wetland trees with loblolly pine. And so that's the kind of thing that we tried to document in that category of vegetation replacement. And the crews were very good about giving us notes about exactly what they were including in those categories.
Right on. And I'm briefly collating questions to see if the other ones that have come in are thematically tied to that. Aaron Donato says, thanks. Thanks for the question, Aaron. And another one of the questions that, did the data reveal the cause of such a high invasive species density on the West Coast? And I'll actually expand upon that. I guess the West Coast versus the Intermountain West, did the data reveal any differences in those causes mechanistically, or how do you separate kind of the arid West from the coastal West in terms of those abundances?
We were not able to do that, although because we didn't split them out as far as reporting units, so we reported out on the West as a whole. However, We do have information on the locations of sites, so if you're interested in what happened in a particular area, we wouldn't be able to make population estimates, but we do know what happened on those individual sites. And as far as the sources, we know that there's a lot of activity going on in these western sites that could lend to the amount of non-native species that we were seeing. So there were 72% of the area in the west of the wetlands in our target population had high levels of non-native plants. But there also was documented a whole number of types of land uses. For instance, the lumbering that goes on, and in particular cattle, that help to spread those non-native species. And so there are a lot of lands on which those kinds of activities occur, and that we surmise that that's part of the reason that we see such a large percentage of the area affected.
Thanks, Mary. And Dave Burdick wanted to know if, he states, wetland function is often closely tied to hydrology, and he wanted to know what was the thinking in dividing ditch and dam impacts, because they're basically two ends of the same continuum of direct hydrologic alteration. And like I said to Aaron, Dave, if you want to clarify anything about that question, feel free to type into the window.
Okay, well, the reason we separated ditching and damming was so that we could keep track of specific types of disturbances. And then we felt we could always aggregate again if we wanted to, as Dave suggested, or but we'd have difficulty going back and disaggregating if we didn't take the information the way we did. So that's the reason why we have it that way, the ditching and the damming.
All right, now moving to kind of a landscape scale question. Urban wetlands, not necessarily abundant, ask Aaron Turner. Do you think the condition of those wetlands, those urban wetlands, are accurately captured in this assessment? And then she states, urban wetlands are closer proximity to larger urban centers, so their landscape matrix is probably a lot different when they do exist. So I guess more broadly, how well do you think it reflected the status of urban wetlands? And were you able to capture the stresses that come from that landscape context versus local stressors that you may see at other wetlands that are in more agrarian or natural settings?
So what's important to remember is this is a national assessment. So it's large scale and regional. And so it's very difficult for us to tease out the details on specific types of wetlands like those in urban wetlands, or even as you saw with our aggregation of wetland types, we just don't have the sample size to do that. That said, I'm confident, given the types of situations and wetland types that we saw in the national assessment, that our methods worked well to capture what was going on in those wetlands and describe their condition, and also the types of disturbances that were occurring in any of the immediate vicinity of those wetlands. We do have a paper that will soon be submitted to environmental management that looks at the larger landscape stressors in the vicinity of our sites, and how they add to the story of what we had from the information we gathered in the buffer. So that's a piece of the research that's coming up. But I'm sorry I can't tell you specifically about urban wetlands. I am pretty confident that what we did, probably with some adjustments for the specific questions that you want to ask about those systems, that the approach that we used could be used for urban wetland systems, but that would take a different design.
And we've got a little bit more time for questions, so if you have any straggling questions, thanks so much to Aaron, Dave, and Kirsty for engaging with the content. If you have any other questions, please get those in. In the meantime, I will just ask Mary, do you care to reiterate when and where folks will be able to get data for their research needs and for their applications if they want to kind of surf through the outputs?
Sure, and what we need to do is back up one slide. I don't know, I'll let you do that, Nate, because I assume you have control. Yeah, so the website listed at the top is where you can find a link to the data sets. And I think it's very important that you look at the technical report before you start just, using the data sets, how they appeal to you, so you really understand what they represent and any kind of constraints there are on the use of that particular data. So in combination with the technical report, you can get the data sets and have a pretty good idea of how that information can be used. And also get into looking to see the answers to some of the questions that have been asked here in terms of, okay, what does it look like in our coastal wetlands versus inland wetlands and that kind of thing. But that's where to find it. It's posted there. And the data are posted for all of the NARS surveys. So if you're interested in rivers and streams, lakes, or coastal systems, also you can go, I think you can find the link to them from this link also.
Well, thank you, Mary. And thank you very much for putting this together. We really appreciate you taking the time to give today's webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, thank you so much for your contributions to the Society and the Northwest chapter. It's been great to see all the work that's come out of your office and from your collaborators and yourself over the years. So if we don't have any questions, please direct correspondence directly to Dr. Ken Tula and the group in Corvallis. And I'm going to move forward just 2 slides. And our next webinar will actually be October 26th, so just over a month from today. Will reintroduction of fire along coastal gradients promote lateral migration of marsh and enhance biodiversity? And that's going to be given by Dr. Julia Cherry and Dr. Loretta Battaglia, both of whom have served on our executive board and been massively involved with the Society. So we keep getting really fantastic talks from folks who have invested a lot in the Society and invested a lot in communicating their science and their programs. I highly encourage you to stick around and come to the next webinar. And I should also note that we're always looking for future webinar presenters. We're always interested in hearing about the topics that you would like to hear about, or if you know somebody who has an interesting topic that you think would give a great engaging presentation like Dr. Ken Tula just did, please reach out to contact somebody at SWS headquarters. Michelle Sozek would love to hear from you. And you can do that through the survey at the conclusion of the webinar as well. And lastly, I should note that June 5th through 8th, we are going to head down as a society, collectively, we're going to head down to San Juan, Puerto Rico for the Celebrating Wetland Diversity Across the Landscape, Mountains to Mangroves SWS 2017 conference. Planning for that is underway. We've just recently had our call for the SWAMP program, the Undergraduate Diversity Mentoring Program. So if you know any students who fit the bill for that and have interesting research or are working with mentors and have an engaging presentation or poster, we'd really like to see a great group of folks turn out for the SWAMP program, a great group of folks turn out for the plenary sessions, and feel free to get those nominations in for symposia sessions, field trips, and undergraduate students, as well as awards will come down the pipe later on. So we're already well into next year's planning, and like most of the folks that work at SWS, and on behalf of those folks, I want to say thanks to everybody for being so engaged, being so tied in with the Society. We really look forward to working together to make another great annual meeting. And on that note, we will close the presentation. Thank you again, Dr. Ken Tula. We greatly appreciate it, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.